Hello, my wonderful third graders. I hope you are having a fantastic day. We are still in our Domain 6, the Viking Age, and the lesson for today is called Family Life. So we're going to hear more about Bjorn and his story and see what happens. Some words you'll hear throughout the read aloud: embers, the glowing pieces left over from a dying fire. Extracted, pulled something out from something else. Joe extracted the splinter from Philip's finger with tweezers. Interrogate means to question someone thoroughly. Livestock, animals that are useful for farming and that can be used for food. An example, the farmer had livestock that helped to pull his wagon and provide meat for his family. Population is the total number of people living in an area. The population of this small town was around 500. Tunic is a noun, it's a thing, a slip-on piece of clothing that is knee-length or longer and is often belted at the waist. Janny wore a lightweight tunic to the cookout that kept her cool in the summertime heat. So what have we learned so far? Vikings traveled to other places to trade, raid, and explore other lands. What would Bjorn have called a warrior who went on a raid? That's right, a Viking, right? Not all the people in that area were Vikings, right? Vikings were the warriors that went on raids. Vikings could sneak up and launch a surprise raid. What were the warriors who worked themselves up into a war frenzy called? Berserks. Maybe you've heard the saying, don't go berserk, right? That's probably where that came from. Which ship was used for raids? So look at these three ships here. We have a rowboat, a longship, and a cargo ship. Of those three ships, which one was used for raids? Think about what they look like and their names. The longship, right? Or the Drakkar. Vikings also relied on trading to gain goods. How does trading work? What would the Vikings import and export? When we talked about Rome, we talked about imports and exports. Remember, imports come into the city and exports is what the Vikings would have taken out to trade, right? Think of exit, export, leaving that city. So an import, something that they would bring into their city, would be silver, grain, spices, silk, and glass. So that would come from other countries, other lands. But they would export, that means they would send it out to trade with it, slaves, furs, fish, timber, ivory, and woolen cloth. Look at these ships again. Which ship was used for trading? Which one makes sense? Right, the cargo ship, or nar. The Norse people also fished and farmed in their homeland of Scandinavia for their survival. Which ships were used for fishing? That's right, rowboats or fairings. All right, let's get back to Bjorn and his story. As we crept inside the house, I could tell that almost everyone was asleep. Only my father was still awake. I could just about make out his shadowy profile as he sat on the ground near the fire, where only the glowing embers remained. "See you in the morning," whispered Tully as he attempted to creep away in the darkness. "Boys, come here a moment," my father said in a raised whisper. He was not going to let either of us get away quite so easily. "Where have you been?" he asked as we sat down beside him. At first, neither of us responded until finally I muttered, "At the wharf, father." "What were you doing there?" he asked, continuing to interrogate us. "Looking at the ships," offered Tully. "One of the warships is being readied for a raid." "Is that so?" he replied. Tully would like to go with them," I offered. "But not you?" he said as if he was stating a fact. I did not reply. You ever been interrogated by your parents because you did something wrong or you didn't come inside when you were supposed to? A warrior does not always know when he is ready to be a warrior, he said softly. Only Odin and Tyr know that. When the time for fighting arrives, you will both be ready. Now get some sleep. You have chores to do in the morning. Tolly and I stood up and kissed my father. Then we scuttled off into the darkness of the central hall. See you bright and early in the morning, I teased Tolly, knowing that he hated to get up before the sun had risen in the sky. I took off my woolen tunic and lay down. It felt good to rest my head upon my down pillow. I pulled my woolen blanket up around me and closed my eyes. So a tunic is a slip-on knee-length piece of clothing that is often belted at the waist. Do you remember who are Odin and Tyr? Viking gods, right? Excuse me. My grandmother was always the first one to get up. Each morning before sunrise, she made porridge and bread for the entire family. Shortly after she arose, my father and mother would join her by the hearth. Mother would add logs to the embers, and father would disappear into his forge. Within minutes, Uncle Sven, my mother's brother, would join my father, and the day's work would begin. The sound of the hammer hitting the anvil and the hiss of hot metal and fire were never far away. I lay in the semi-darkness, listening to the early morning hustle and bustle. These were the sounds of my childhood. These were the memories that I would keep in my heart for the rest of my life. Suddenly my eyes began to water. I quickly pinched myself to stop the flow of tears. Why do you think he's crying? As the porridge simmered and the bread baked, Mother, Grandmother, and Aunt Kristen went to work in the small room behind the central hall. This was the room where sheep's wool was spun, woven on a loom, and sewn into warm clothes and blankets. Thread from flax was also woven into lighter linen garments that would be worn during the warmer months. In addition to looking after the chickens, my sister Kita was being taught as an apprentice how to spin, weave, and sew in the same way that I was being taught how to be a blacksmith. So flax is a plant that can be harvested and used to make clothes. It is also a source of food, both as a seed and as an oil. My Aunt Kristen was perhaps one of the most skillful women in our town at using vegetable dyes from plants to color woolen and linen cloth before it was cut and sewn into garments. She explained to me once that the color blue was extracted from the woad plant, the color red was extracted from madder, and yellow was extracted from weld. We children were responsible for gathering these plants. So here's some pictures of those plants. These plants can still be used today to dye cloth. So we see woad, madder, and weld plant in these pictures. Isn't it interesting how, what did they say? You get the colors blue, red, and yellow from these green plants. Pretty cool. Tully did not work as an apprentice like me. Instead, he worked on his Uncle Eric's farm on the edge of town. There, he tended the flock of sheep that provided many of the townspeople with wool. He also cared for the herd of cattle that provided additional milk as well as meat. Although there was not a lot of it, the grain and vegetables produced in the fields were needed to feed our growing population. Even the long grass was used on the thatch roofs of our houses or to cover the interior earthen floors. Very often in the late part of autumn, the older cattle were killed and the meat was dried. This provided much needed food in the winter time. Tully, Bjorn, Kita, Arnsten, and Carl, it is time to get up, said Grandfather Affy as he shuffled toward us in the dim light. Come on, you sleepy heads. We need more wood for the fire, and we need some eggs. Oh, and get a pitcher of goat's milk, too, he ordered. Could just make out the younger children stretching and yawning. I could see that Tully was the last one to lift his head from his pillow. I heard him yawn loudly several times and then down again. Moments later, Grandfather Affy threw one of his leather shoes at him, and he fell backward out of his bed. Come on, Tully, let's go and chop some wood, I suggested, all the while laughing at him. Tully grunted at me by way of a reply. Not a morning person. Tully and I worked together at chopping up the larger pieces of wood that were stored in an enclosure at the side of the house. Fortunately, our homeland had many forests that provided us with wood for our ships and homes, as well as fuel for the fires in our hearths. Wood was one of the few things we had in abundance. While we chopped wood into logs, Tully and I discussed the journey that we would soon be taking across the great ocean to Iceland. You know, Bjorn, there are enormous sea monsters that can devour a man in one gulp. They dwell in the watery depths of the great ocean, he said quite seriously. It wasn't just children who believed in sea monsters. The adults of the Viking Age believed in them as well. There weren't things like submarines, scuba equipment, or scientists who devoted their lives to studying the ocean. A large whale or shark the Vikings had seen might have been thought to be a sea monster. I've heard stories about them, but I've never seen one, I replied calmly. Well, it's true, he continued. It is best to keep a spear by your side at all times, even when you are sleeping, Tully advised me. You don't want to be caught unarmed if one rises up unexpectedly out of the waves. I wasn't sure a spear would be much use against the creature that Tully had described, but I nodded in agreement. An hour must have passed when we heard the sound of grandmother's voice calling us all into breakfast. She didn't have to call any of us twice. Tully sprinted towards the house, and I followed close behind him. We quickly washed our hands and faces in a bucket of fresh water that had been placed outside the entrance to our home. As we sat together around the hearth, grandmother ladled porridge into wooden bowls, which she had then handed to us. Mother gave each of us a wooden spoon. In addition to the hot porridge, there was fresh bread, cheese, boiled eggs, and dried herring laid out on a large wooden platter. A pitcher of warm goat's milk was placed beside the platter. Each day, Viking families came together to eat 2 meals, breakfast and dinner. Of the two, breakfast was my favorite. At breakfast time, the older family members were less tired and therefore less grumpy, and the events of the day were still a mystery waiting to happen. I sat on the floor between Tully and Kita and devoured the warm porridge. When I finished my bowl of porridge, I reached for some bread and cheese and then poured goat's milk into a wooden cup. Eat up, Bjorn, said my father, smiling at me. Today is the day we begin to make your sword. So herring is a type of fish. It's part of their meals for breakfast. Have you ever had fish for breakfast? All right. Describe the chores of Norse girls. Women and girls would spin sheep's wool and thread from flax, then sew it into clothes and blankets to keep warm. Girls would often look after the farm animals such as chickens. They extracted dyes from plants and vegetables to color garments. Describe the chores of Norse boys. Boys were often apprentices, learning a skill such as blacksmithing. They would also tend to livestock such as sheep. They would also chop wood for fires. How was farming an important part of daily life to the people of the Viking Age? The town's sheep provided people with wool, cattle and goats provided milk and meat, grains and vegetables were an important food source. Grass was used as roofs or floor coverings, flax was used for clothing. Bjorn's father is waiting by the embers of the fire when Tully and Bjorn return. Why does Bjorn's father interrogate them when they arrive home? They are late and he wants to know what they have been doing. Why is Tully concerned about sea monsters? They are getting ready to sail to Iceland, and he has heard myths that sea monsters live in the sea. You heard quite a bit about the meals and the different types of foods Bjorn's family eats. Describe the foods the Norse would eat for breakfast. Norse families often ate only 2 meals a day, breakfast and dinner. Breakfast usually consisted of porridge, fresh bread, cheese, boiled eggs, dried herring, and goat's milk. How is your breakfast different from a Viking breakfast? Well, for my breakfast, I have coffee and usually just one small thing, not that much food, and definitely not fish. What examples in the story show that Beorn is coming of age? Well, at one moment he's remembering the different things that have to do with his childhood, like he's about to grow up. They're talking about the trip that he and Tolly are about to take, right? They're about to sail off as men, grown men. And then also, Beorn's father mentions that it's the day that they're going to get his sword. Our word for the day is extracted. In the read aloud you heard, she explained to me once that the color blue was extracted from the woad plant, the color red was extracted from madder, and yellow was extracted from weld. Say the word extracted. As something has been extracted, it has been drawn or pulled out. Using tweezers, my mom carefully extracted the splinter from my finger. Have you ever extracted something like a splinter from your finger or a baby tooth from your mouth? So synonyms and antonyms. We know what extracted means, right? It means pulled out. What are some synonyms or words that have a similar meaning? Take out, remove, pull out, dig out. What are some words or phrases you know that are antonyms or opposite of extracted? Add, insert, put in, fill. All right, third graders, I hope you enjoyed learning more about Beorn. Keep in mind his morning routines. You're going to have an assignment tomorrow about that. So think about his morning routines a little bit.